Assalamu alaikum dear students. I welcome you to the second lecture of joints. By the end of this lecture you will be able to define synovial joints, their structural components, functions and subclassification of these joints. A brief summary of the classification of the joints that we did in the last lecture. Synovial, that was the immovable joint, partially amphiarthrosis, that are slightly movable joints, and we did the diarthroses, that are the synovial joints. Now we will do the details of the diarthroses. Diarthroses are also known as the cavitated joints. These are also known as the synovial joints. There are different parts of the synovial joints. We will do the detail of each part. We will do the details of each part. Firstly, we have the fibrous capsule, we have the synovial membrane, then we have the synovial fluid, then we have the articular cartilage, articular disc, and the ligaments that stabilize the joint. This is a figure of typical synovial joint. You can see the two bones that are the proximal phalanx and the middle phalanx. This is a synovial joint between the two phalanx. This is basically phalangeal joint. The articular surfaces are covered by articular cartilage. Then you can appreciate a capsule that is present outside, that is surrounding the joint basically, and the capsule has red color, pinkish layer inside, that is the synovial membrane, and the cavity that is present within the fibrous capsule is known as a synovial cavity. Now we come to the general structure, general features of the synovial joint. Firstly, we have the articular capsule or the joint capsule. This is basically composed of connective tissue. Connective tissue that is basically fibrous, and it is composed of collagen fibers basically. It encloses the joint cavity inside and retains the fluid that is known as the synovial fluid. The capsule has two layers. The outer is the fibrous layer that is composed of collagen fibers, and it is continuous with the periosteum of the adjoining bones. Then we have the inner layer or the cellular layer that has got fibroblast like cells that secrete synovial fluid, and it has also got macrophages in it that remove the debris from the joint cavity. Here you can appreciate the joint capsule. It's two layers, outer fibrous that is whitish and pinkish that is the inner layer or the synovial membrane. Now we come to the synovial fluid. Synovial fluid basically gives slippery medium for the free movement of the opposing surfaces of the bones or joint. It is rich in albumin and hyaluronic acid. Its consistency is viscous, just like raw egg white. It nourishes the articular cartilage and gives friction-free environment. Then we come to the articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is basically covering the surfaces of the opposing bones that are involved in the formation of the joint. It is usually 2 to 3 mm thick. The joint cavity is present between the two articular surfaces. Here you can appreciate the articular cartilage on the two opposing bones, synovial cavity. Now we come to the articular disc. Articular disc is present between the that basically divides the joint cavity into two parts, into upper and lower joint cavity. Um, it can be composed of condensed fibers or it can be composed of fibrocartilage. Disc is present between the temporomandibular joint, distal radioulnar joint, sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joints. Here you can appreciate the articular disc in the center that divides the total joint cavity into superior synovial cavity and the inferior synovial cavity. This is the temporomandibular joint. Now we come to the meniscus. Meniscus is basically a cartilage that is present in knee. This is like a incomplete disc, you can say. It has got two cartilages that extend inward from right and left but do not entirely cross the joint. They act as shock absorber, guide the bones, or limit the movement of the joint, stabilize the joint, and reduces the chances of dislocation. In the next slide, you will appreciate the presence of the meniscus and your concepts will be cleared. Here, the highlighted portion, you can see there are two menisci, one on the right and one on the left. These are C-shaped. They do not divide the joint cavity completely into superior and inferior compartments. Rather, it partially divides. Now we come to the accessory structures associated with the synovial joints. Firstly, we have the tendons. Tendons are the strip or sheet of tough collagenous connective tissue that attaches the muscle to the bone. These are the stabilizing structures. Strip of tough connective tissue that attaches the muscle to the bone. Then we have the ligament. Attaches one bone to another. Tendon attaches the muscle to the bone and ligament attaches the one bone to another. Then we have the enthesis. Enthesis is the connective tissue present between the tendon, ligament and the bone. Here you can see the enthesis that is present in the interphalangeal joint. It is present between the tendon, ligament and the bone. Then we come to the labra. It is basically the extension of the walls of the bony socket. That extension is composed of fibrocartilage that make the joint cavity deep. Here there is acetabular labrum, then circled you can see that extends the walls of the acetabulum. Then we come to the bursa. We are doing the associated structures of the synovial joints. Bursa is the fibrous sac filled with synovial fluid located between adjacent muscles and areas where the tendon passes over the bone or between the bone and the skin. It functions like cushion for the muscles, help tendons to slide more easily over the joints, and it also modifies the direction of the pull. Then we have the tendon sheath. Elongated cylindrical bursa is known as the tendon sheath. Basically, it wraps a tendon. Here is the figure. You can see the subacromial bursa, the sac filled with synovial fluid. On this bursa, the coracoacromial ligament that slides over it during movement. Below there is tendon sheath, and it is holding a tendon of long head of bicep brachii. This is the end of the associated structures of synovial joints. Now we come to the classification of the synovial joints. Firstly, they are classified on the basis of complexity. Simple joints, in which there are only two surfaces, one is concave, the other one is convex. Examples include shoulder joint, interphalangeal joints. Then we have another classification, another type, that is a compound joint, in which there are more than two articulating surfaces. Best example is the elbow, in which there is humerus articulates with the radius and ulna. Then we come to the complex joints, in which there is articular disc. Examples are sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, and knee joint. This classification was on the basis of the complexity. Now we come to the second classification, that is on the basis of degree of movement of the joint. Uniaxial, the movement will only be in one axis. Then biaxial movements. Then we have the multi-axial movements. Multi-axial movements include rotational movements as well. Now we come to the third classification of the synovial joints, that is based upon the shape of the articulating surfaces. We have plane joints, we have hinge joints, we have pivot joints, we have bicondylar joints, we have ellipsoid, we have cellular joints, we have saddle joints, and we have the spheroidal joints. Now we come to the plane joints. In plane joints, the opposing surfaces of the joint are flat. Best example is the acromioclavicular joint. This allows only sliding and gliding movements because the surfaces are plane. This is uniaxial joint. This is basically plane joint. Now we come to the hinge joint. Hinge joint is uniaxial, first type of uniaxial joint in which one surface is concave, the other one is convex. It allows movement around transverse axis, flexion and extension, basically movements that are brought about in these types of joints. Best examples are the elbow joint and interphalangeal joints and humerus and ulna. These are also known as the gangliomoid joints. Then we come to the pivot joints. Pivot joints, you can see here, this is the cervical vertebrae. This is the C1 vertebra, upper one, and the lower one is the C2. There is elongated dens present on the superior aspect of the body of the C2 or the axis. C1 is a ring-like. The movement occurs in this type of joint it occurs around vertical axis. That is also known as a rotational movement. Pronation and supination are also brought about by this joint. Best examples are the radio-ulnar and atlantoaxial joint. This is the atlantoaxial joint. Now we come to the ellipsoid joints. Ellipsoid joint is the example of the biaxial joint. Oval convex surface fits into ellipsoid cavity. Best example is the metacarpophalangeal joint and the wrist joint. Here movements are brought about along two axes. First is the transverse axis, which allow flexion and extension. The other movement is brought about by anteroposterior axis, that is the abduction and the adduction movements. Now we come to the saddle joints. These are also known as the cellular joints. The articulating surfaces are concavo-convex. Both surfaces are concavo-convex, and they allow movement in two axes like ellipsoid joints along transverse and anteroposterior axis. They allow flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, and slight rotation also. Best example are the carpometacarpal joint, and ankle and calcaneocuboidal joint. Here you can appreciate the concavo-convex surfaces of the two opposing bones. Here, trapezium and the first carpal joint is also cellular joint. Now we come to the condylar joint. Condyle fits into concave surface. They allow movement along transverse axis that are flexion and extension. They also allow movement along vertical axis that are basically the rotational movements. Best examples are the knee and the temporomandibular joint. Metacarpophalangeal joint is also the example of this condylar variety. Now we come to the last type of joint, that is the ball and socket joint. This is also known as the spheroidal joints. The joints we did previously, they all allow biaxial movements. This is the type of multi-axial joint. In this type, the head of one bone fits into cup-like concavity of another bone. Here you can see acetabulum and the head of the femur. This allows circumduction, that has got flexion, extension, abduction and adduction. Basically this is the rotational movement. Shoulder joint and the hip joints are the examples of this type of joint. Then we come to the summary. In the previous lecture of my joints, we did the fibrous and the cartilaginous joints. We did their subclassifications also. In this lecture, we did the synovial joints. And we did the details of the different types of synovial joints. This is the short summary of all types of joints. Here you can see plane joints, gliding movements they allow. Then there are the uniaxial joints that include hinge joints and the pivot joints. Then there are the biaxial joints, ellipsoid, saddle joints and bicondylar joints. Then we have the multi-axial joints that include the ball and socket joints. Thank you.